Okay, let's dive in. Imagine taking everything you thought you knew about Buddhism, the practices, the texts, even the stories about the Buddha himself, and asking, what if some of it isn't based on the historical Buddha's original teachings at all, but perhaps on something more like, well, historical novels or cultural interpretations that evolved long after he was gone?
That's a pretty fundamental challenge, isn't it? It really asks us to, look critically at the foundations of something many people take for granted.
Absolutely. And that's precisely what we're unpacking today in this deep dive. We're working from a fascinating source, a transcript from a YouTube workshop by the Sadi School. Their focus is something they call critical practice, and it's all about applying a rigorous, critical lens to how we understand and practice Buddhism today.
hmm So our mission really is to guide you through the core arguments and insights presented in this transcript. It offers a perspective that definitely challenges some common assumptions about Buddhism's history, its text, and what authentic practice really means.
Yeah, and while the speaker's context is often Korean Buddhism, the implications, they feel pretty global.
Oh, absolutely.
Correct.
The implications of this critique are global. So let's try and uncover these surprising nuggets together.
All right, let's start by understanding this critical lens. The speaker introduces a term, critical practice. What exactly are they getting at here?
So the speaker says critical practice is a term they started using about 2 years ago. It's meant to describe the various practice techniques taught within their specific system, which is based on the Eightfold Path,
Oh, okay.
but approached with a particular mindset, a critical one.
And this mindset isn't entirely new. It's inspired by an earlier academic movement.
Exactly. They draw inspiration from something called critical Buddhism, which emerged much earlier, actually, around 40 years ago, specifically in 1989.
1989. Wow, late 80s. Where did this critical Buddhism originate?
It came from Japan, specifically from two professors, Hakamaya Noriaki and Matsumoto Shiro, at Komazawa University.
Komazawa University.
Yeah, and it's maybe worth noting that Komazawa was founded by the Tsuchi Zen sect. So this critique was coming from, within a Mahayana tradition, which adds another layer.
Right. And what was the core of their critical Buddhism? What were they challenging?
Well, their critique was pretty radical, honestly. They fundamentally questioned whether major Mahayana concepts, things like Tathagatagarbha, thought, the idea of inherent Buddha nature.
Mm-hmm. Like in the Avatamsaka Sutra.
Exactly, prominent there.
Mhm.
Or even the lineage and forms of Chinese Zen. They questioned if these were genuinely the Buddha's true original teachings. They argued these might be later developments.
Wow. That would have been quite controversial, challenging core ideas of Mahayana and Zen like that.
Oh, it absolutely caused a significant stir, shock, debate, the whole thing within global Buddhist academia back then in the late 1980s.
I bet.
On one hand, it definitely led to academic growth and reexamination, but on the other, it really highlighted potential historical and textual inconsistencies with beliefs that had been, well, accepted for centuries.
So the speaker's critical practice takes that academic rigor, that questioning spirit,
Yes,
and applies it directly to the practice itself.
precisely. The central aim of critical practice, as they define it, is to rigorously examine popular modern practices, everything from, say, Quan Zen to Vipassana, mindfulness, chanting, rituals, and ask, are these truly the meditation methods the historical Buddha taught? Or are they later additions, cultural forms?
That sounds like a difficult task. And the speaker points out a historical reason why this kind of critical examination of practice has been challenging.
Yeah, they highlight this long-standing divide. Often, scholars who study and write about Buddhist practice, well, they lack significant personal embodied experience with those practices.
Right, the theory without the practice.
Exactly. And conversely, experienced practitioners might lack the academic training or, the critical tools to analyze the historical texts or the lineages properly.
So there's a gap.
A big gap. The speaker feels their school is in a position to maybe help bridge this gap.
Okay, that provides a helpful framework. Now let's shift to some foundational perspectives the speaker offers for understanding Buddhism, which inform their critical approach.
Right. First, and this is crucial, they emphasize seeing the Buddha as a historical figure. Gautama lived 2,600 years ago.
Just stating the facts.
Yeah? He was an Aryan, lived in what's now India and Nepal, and spoke an Indo-European language. Importantly, not an East Asian one.
That immediately challenges any subconscious assumption, doesn't it? That because Buddhism is big in East Asia, the Buddha himself must have been culturally East Asian somehow.
It really does.
Yeah.
They also offer this fascinating cultural contrast between Indian culture, with its preference for detailed enumeration, filling all the space, Think of the intricate colors and figures in Indian temple art.
Very dense.
And contrast that with Chinese culture's preference for brevity and empty space, like in ink wash painting.
That's a great visual analogy.
And they suggest this cultural lens can help understand how teachings might be transmitted and, well, interpreted differently across cultures.
Makes sense.
And the scriptures themselves, according to the speaker, depict the Buddha as quite strict, which might differ from some of the, softer, more generalized popular images we might have.
Okay.
But the most critical point here is about the transmission over vast time and distance.
Right, the 2,600 years and thousands of miles, that's huge.
It is. And the speaker states clearly that assuming the Buddha's teachings remain completely unchanged over 2.5 millennia and across continents is, in their words, either naive or ignorant. Change is just an inherent reality, especially over such a massive span.
Fair enough. Now, speaking of cultural lenses and potential biases, the speaker coins an interesting term, Buddhist Orientalism.
Yes, they draw an analogy to Western Orientalism, where the West often views the East through a biased lens, sometimes assuming Western superiority.
Okay.
Buddhist Orientalism, in their usage, suggests a potential bias within East Asian Buddhist studies and practice, where there's maybe an assumption that Western interpretations or forms, particularly American ones, are somehow superior, more authentic, or more advanced.
Huh. How does the source illustrate this historical bias?
Well, they give examples, like how East Asian scholars historically first went to Japan to study, learning from Japanese scholars who had themselves learned from Westerners, perhaps like those at Oxford.
Right, a sort of indirect route.
Exactly. And then later, scholars started going directly to study in the West, places like Germany, Paris. And they mentioned monks like Hojian and Biabyang in the 70s doing this, or Harvard, mentioning someone like Yinan.
And they observe that this preference for Western degrees persists even now.
Yes. They note many current Korean Buddhist professors have Western degrees. And they suggest this bias might still be at play, this assumption that a Western academic credential somehow confers greater authority or insight into Buddhism, even though it originated elsewhere entirely.
And this potentially influences which practices get adopted today.
Precisely. This is where their critique of adopting American mindfulness comes in pretty strongly. The speaker questions if choosing American mindfulness, which itself derived from Burmese Vipassana, remember, reflects this Buddhist Orientalism. Why adopt a practice form filtered through America, they ask, when the original Vipassana is available in countries geographically and historically much closer to the roots of Buddhism, like Myanmar or Sri Lanka or Thailand?
That really makes you pause and consider the layers of transmission, doesn't it?
Right.
Let's touch on Buddhism's relationship with its origins in India and Hinduism.
Okay. The source emphasizes that Buddhism arose from India, yes, coexisting with, but also fundamentally negating certain aspects of Hinduism.
Negating, how so?
While there are shared cultural elements and even some shared practices like samatha meditation, focused concentration, which was apparently a core technique in Hindu yoga before the Buddha's time.
Oh, interesting.
The speaker stresses there are fundamental differences in worldview, especially concerning the nature of the world, rebirth, and the concept of deity. Buddhism offers a different philosophical framework.
So common ground in technique, perhaps, but fundamental divergence in philosophy.
That seems to be the point, yes. Now, turning to the Buddha's own journey, a key insight from the source is about his initial purpose.
What was that?
The Buddha initially practiced to solve his own problem, his own suffering. He wasn't, setting out to enlighten the world from day one.
That makes perfect sense. You have to find the path yourself before you can effectively show others.
Exactly. It was only after he achieved enlightenment, after resolving his own suffering, that he dedicated himself to helping others find the same freedom.
Okay.
And they connect this directly to the very beginning of the Buddha's public ministry, quoting the first sentence of the declaration he made in Sarnath. His action was for the freedom and happiness of many beings.
Freedom and happiness. That sounds like a very direct and, well, positive goal for Buddhism.
It is. Yeah. And the speaker links this goal back to the fundamental nature of Buddhism, emphasizing that its very foundation is practice.
Practice is key.
Absolutely. They even mention the Korean monk Bujo Jinul's reform movement back in the Goryeo dynasty, which also emphasized returning to practice, arguing that Buddhism's decline then was due to neglecting practice.
So practice is essential, both for the Buddha's personal path and for the mission he established. Another perspective the source offers is simply acknowledging the Buddha was human.
Yes, he wasn't some ethereal being floating above it all. The source reiterates he was a person who experienced human realities, human challenges.
Like what?
They even cite scriptural examples, like times he apparently failed to receive food during his alms rounds, experiencing the basic human vulnerability of sometimes not getting what you need.
That's a grounding reminder, isn't it?
It is. The speaker also offers a kind of critical observation about the frequent mentions in scriptures of the Buddha interacting with kings and wealthy patrons, like King Bimbisara or Anathapindika, the merchant who donated the Jetavana monastery.
Okay, what's the perspective offered here? Is it critical?
It's presented as a critical viewpoint to consider. The speaker prompts us to look at this realistically. While it could absolutely be seen as genuine reverence from these powerful people,
Or
could it also, from a certain angle, appear like seeking influence? They draw a parallel to how we might view a modern religious figure who seemed to only associate with the powerful and wealthy.
I see the comparison.
The point isn't necessarily to cast judgment, but to encourage seeing the Buddha as a historical person operating within the social dynamics of his time, rather than solely through a purely idealized, maybe deified lens.
That encourages a more nuanced, realistic view. Let's talk about something unavoidable, change.
Right. Change is constant. And over 2,600 years, Buddhism has obviously changed. The source points out that Mahayana Buddhism itself emerged around 500 years after the Buddha's death.
And why did Mahayana emerge according to the source?
The source suggests it was because people at that time felt the existing form of Buddhism was, well, insufficient or no longer meeting their needs adequately.
Yeah. So Mahayana was itself a significant change, a kind of reform movement.
Exactly. And the speaker highlights what they see as a core contradiction here.
Which is?
If Mahayana emerged as a major change 2,000 years ago because the previous form was deemed insufficient, then strong resistance to change or reform today within Mahayana traditions is, in their view, illogical.
That's a sharp observation. If change was okay, then why not now?
Precisely. And it underpins their call to return to what they see as the original form of practice. They define this original form as roughly the first 150 years after the Buddha's passing.
The period of his direct disciples.
Yes, the time of his direct disciples who received the teachings and practiced under his or their immediate guidance. That's the standard they advocate returning to.
Okay. Let's explore the idea of universality and particularity in Buddhism.
Sure. The source explains that Buddhism has universal principles, core truths like dependent origination, the Four Noble Truths, the 12 links of dependent origination. These are the fundamental teachings, the universals.
But it also has particular expressions, local flavors,
Right, exactly. Forms that adapted to local history, geography, and culture. They use the example of offerings.
How so?
Well, in places with abundant flowers, people naturally offer flowers. But in resource-scarce places like, say, Tibet or Mongolia, where flowers might be rare, the offering might take the form of chanting mantras instead. It's an adaptation to the environment.
Like the Suri Suri Mahazuri Susuri Svaha mantra mentioned in the source.
Yes, that specific mantra, which the source links to cleansing, could be an example of a practice that became culturally significant, perhaps in regions where, say, water for physical cleansing was less available. The key is that the speaker intends to focus on the universal principles, which they believe transcend these particular cultural forms.
Got it. Universal principles, particular expressions. Finally, on these foundational points, let's just reiterate the Buddha's core aim.
The source is very clear on this. The Buddha's goal was twofold, both happiness to help beings live happily and liberation from the cycle of rebirth, samsara.
Happiness is explicitly a goal. That might surprise some who view Buddhist practice as solely focused on ending suffering, maybe overlooking the positive aspiration side.
It could. The speaker notes that traditionally, pursuing happiness through practice might have been seen in some circles as, I don't know, less serious or something.
Right.
But they point out that modern mindfulness explicitly emphasizes happiness as an outcome, which the source sees as fully aligned with the Buddha's initial declaration back in Sarnath about working for freedom and happiness.
So it's not a modern invention, necessarily.
Not according to this view. The ultimate goal, they stress, is liberation from samsara, not just dwelling on samsara itself. And they link this directly back to their school's fundamental principle: training practitioners dedicated to humanity's freedom and happiness through practice.
Okay, that gives us a really solid grounding in the source's perspective. Now let's get into some common misunderstandings it highlights and important truths it wants to emphasize.
Right. A critical point the speaker makes is about the differences between Buddhist schools, say Vipassana and Seon, which is Korean Zen.
Okay. How should we understand those differences?
They argue these differences should be understood primarily as differences in culture or expression, rather than fundamental differences in the Dharma, the core teaching itself.
So, different cultural pathways leading to the same core truth, different packaging, maybe.
That's the idea, yeah. The source argues that framing them as inherently different truths risks implying one is original and the other is somehow fake, which they see as unproductive and just fostering division.
Yeah, that doesn't sound helpful.
No. And they point to figures like the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh who, while practicing within their distinct cultural forms, Tibetan and Vietnamese Zen respectively, consistently emphasize the universal Buddhist values and core Dharma they share.
And the speaker critiques a tendency they observe, maybe particularly in Korea, to overemphasize distinctions.
Yes, they specifically link this to Korean culture, observing what they see as a tendency to focus on differences, even minor ones, which can lead to discarding much that is actually shared.
Interesting cultural observation.
They contrast this with cultures having large, diverse populations, like India or China, where survival and cooperation often depend more on finding common ground and emphasizing similarities. Within Buddhism, they argue, there are vast similarities across schools. Focusing on these is crucial for unity and progress.
That definitely shifts the focus from us versus them to how are we similar. Now let's talk about reform efforts in Buddhism.
Okay. The source notes that past reform movements, like the emergence of Mahayana itself, eventually diverged from the very initial root, the earliest teachings.
Right.
So the speaker argues that for current reform efforts, particularly in Korean Buddhism, to be truly successful and sustainable, they should return to the initial standard, what they call fundamental Buddhism, the teachings of the first 150 years or so, rather than trying to reform based on later interpretations or movements.
So don't just fix the latest branch. Go back to the root for genuine revitalization. Don't model reform on previous reforms that already diverged.
Exactly. That's the core argument. The speaker feels that often Korean practitioners seem to be circling the periphery of the tradition rather than going directly to the core, the original teachings and practices.
It makes sense. Related to practice, the source touches on the aspiration to save all beings, a big Mahayana vow.
Yes, a very core vow.
How?
The speaker points out that this noble aspiration requires the means to achieve it.
You can't just wish it.
Right. And that means is practice leading to enlightenment and the elimination of defilements, the mental hindrances. They connect the four great vows intrinsically to the four immeasurables: love, compassion, joy, equanimity, but stress that the focus must be on how to actually achieve salvation via practice, not just express in the lofty wish.
Okay, this leads to a very significant, potentially challenging point the source makes about texts and teachers. This sounds important.
It is. It's a crucial critique. The speaker argues that trying to understand the historical Buddha using Mahayana texts written, say, 600 to 1,000 years after he died is highly questionable.
Questionable how?
They quite starkly liken these texts to historical novels.
Wow. Not historical accounts, but historical novels. That's a strong statement.
It is. That's the distinction they draw. They argue that using these later texts as primary historical sources for the Buddha's life and direct teachings is a serious error. They even note that standard Buddhist dictionaries indicate these texts were compiled centuries later, though perhaps without using such provocative language. But it fundamentally changes how you might approach Mahayana literature if you accept this view.
That's a huge point and has massive implications for how many people understand and study Buddhism.
It really does. The second part of this critique is about teachers.
Okay.
The source is adamant that teachers of Buddhist practice must have practice experience, genuine, deep practice experience.
Not just book learning.
Exactly. They use the analogy of an English teacher needing conversational skill to teach speaking. You can't teach practice effectively just from theory or reading texts. A Buddhist teacher needs direct, embodied experience, especially since the Buddha himself emphasized practice as the path to realization. They see a lack of genuine practice experience among some teachers as a significant problem today.
So 2 big points. Be careful with much later texts as historical sources and ensure teachers have real practice experience. And just to be clear, when the speaker talks about the original period or original form,
Yeah, they are defining that as approximately the first 150 years after the Buddha's death. The time of his immediate disciples who learned directly from him or those who learned from them, that's their benchmark.
got it. They also caution against the way certain terms are used, like Southern Buddhism. What's the issue there?
Yes, From a Korean or Chinese perspective, India is geographically south, right?
Right.
So calling Theravada Buddhism Southern Buddhism relative to that geography is understandable, makes sense on a map. But the source suggests being careful not to conflate that geographical label with understanding it as a lineage rooted in the original geographical location of the Buddha's activities, which was India. It's about precision in historical and geographical context, not letting a relative term obscure the origin.
Right. And regardless of the school, fundamental Mahayana Tantra India is the origin point.
Fundamentally, yes. The source states that almost all major Buddhist concepts and forms originated in India. While there might be some unique developments later, maybe associated with specific Chinese Zen masters, understanding India is essential for understanding Buddhism in general. You have to go back to the source.
Okay. How were the different aspects of practice integrated in the Buddha's time? Vinaya, Sutra, Abhidharma.
The source makes a key point here. Vinaya, which is precepts, monastic discipline; Sutra, the discourses, scriptures; and Abhidharma, philosophical analysis. These were not separate disciplines or institutions back then.
Not like having different temples specializing in each today.
Exactly. Monks in the Buddhist time learned texts, engaged in chanting and rituals, and kept precepts as a single unified path. And the whole thing was geared towards practice and realization.
It was all interconnected for that purpose.
Precisely. They also note practical details, like the monks' robes. They were just ordinary, functional clothing worn all the time, not special ceremonial garments only brought out for occasions. They see this as reflecting that integrated, practice-focused life.
Interesting detail. The source also distinguishes between the roles of scholars and practitioners. How do they see that?
Yeah, they draw a clear line. Buddhist scholars, they say, are like political science professors analyzing politics. Their job is to analyze and explain Buddhist phenomena. Their responsibility is analysis.
Okay.
Practitioners, however, are the ones who embody and live the teachings. They bear direct responsibility for the actual state and welfare of Buddhism itself, for keeping the teachings alive and real through their practice.
That places a different kind of weight on the practitioner, doesn't it?
It does. A responsibility for the tradition itself. Now, what about the focus of Buddhism? Is it about material success, getting rich, getting into college? The source is quite firm here. Buddhism's core domain is the mind, not material gain. Praying for external material success, whether it's passing an exam, getting into a good college, having a successful business, is outside its central focus.
So it's not a cosmic vending machine for worldly desires. You can't just pray for a new car.
Not directly, no. The source clarifies that while Buddhist practice can certainly help with the stress and mental anguish related to pursuing material things.
Okay, the inner state.
Right. But it doesn't guarantee the external results themselves. They offer a pretty pointed critique here, saying expecting the Buddha to grant material favors is like the absurdity of trying to bribe a teacher for a good grade.
That's a strong analogy. Challenges a common misconception, maybe.
Definitely challenges it. So what then is the absolute centrality, according to the speaker?
It has to be practice right.
Practice. Absolutely. While traditional views might broadly define practice to include almost everything, prayer, chanting, copying scriptures, making offerings.
Yeah, you hear that a lot. Everything is practice.
Right. But the speaker notes that often practice itself, the core meditative path, gets neglected while people focus on these other activities. They pose the logical question: if everything is practice, then shouldn't simply doing practice, the core method, be sufficient?
Interesting point.
The speaker also makes a personal observation, saying they find practice itself relatively easy, and suggests everything is a subject for practice, though they kind of reserve deeper discussion on that for later.
And they push back against making practice seem overly complex or dramatic, like it's some secret art.
Yes, they emphasize that practice is fundamentally ordinary. It's not a dramatic spectacle like something out of a martial arts movie. Making it seem overly complicated or inaccessible to those without specialized knowledge or experience is unhelpful. It's a technique meant to be applied by anyone.
A technique, like in engineering, is that the comparison?
That's the analogy they use, yeah. Practice is a technique, like in engineering. Understanding the underlying principles, the why, leads to creativity. And mastering the technique, the how, leads to effectiveness. Practice requires both that deep understanding and the skillful application.
Principle and technique. Got it. What about the difference between having Buddha nature and actually becoming a Buddha?
Good question. Having Buddha nature, according to this view, is having the potential, the inherent capacity. But merely possessing that potential doesn't make you a Buddha.
Potential isn't realization.
Exactly. One doesn't become a Buddha without going through the actual process, the path.
Yeah.
And that process is practice. Potential needs to be actualized through effort.
Okay. And the source touches on self-benefit and altruism. How do they relate?
The source notes that all beings naturally act for what they perceive as their own benefit. That's just natural. But through practice, one can evolve. Evolve to understand that helping others is not actually separate from one's true self-interest, or perhaps more profoundly, that acting for the well-being of others is simply the right thing to do as a human being, regardless of benefit.
Does the source link ethics solely to belief in rebirth? Like,
Yeah.
you don't steal because you fear a bad rebirth.
They challenge that idea directly. The speaker argues that ethical behavior, like refraining from stealing, doesn't necessarily depend on believing in rebirth.
Oh.
People refrain from harmful acts not just out of fear of consequences, whether that's prison in this life or a bad rebirth in the next, but because it is fundamentally wrong as a human being. There's an intrinsic sense of ethics.
How do they illustrate that?
By noting that people generally don't steal even when they could easily get away with it. It's not solely due to fear of punishment, but because there's an internal moral compass, a sense of right and wrong.
So ethics can be seen as grounded in our shared humanity, not just dependent on belief in cosmic consequences.
That's the argument the source presents, yes. And finally, perhaps one of the strongest points from the source, related to all this, is about self-power.
Self-power. What is the core message here?
According to this source, Buddhism is fundamentally a religion of self-power. You have to do the work yourself.
Okay. What about relying on Buddhas or Bodhisattvas? Other power.
That reliance on external figures, what's often termed other power, should be seen as a temporary support, like a crutch. Useful during times of extreme hardship, maybe like using anesthetic before surgery is the analogy they use.
But not a permanent state, not the main path.
Exactly. The source argues that perpetual reliance on other power actually hinders one's own progress towards enlightenment. It keeps you in a state of dependence rather than developing the self-power needed to become a Buddha yourself, which is ultimately the hope of the path.
So constantly relying on external figures ultimately prevents you from realizing your own potential, from achieving the goal yourself.
That's the critique. It's a powerful pushback against purely devotional approaches, emphasizing the need for personal effort and practice.
Wow, okay, that's a lot of critical perspective. Based on all this, what vision for the future does the speaker outline? Where are they going with this?
Well, the speaker says their current work is squarely aimed at reestablishing what they see as the Buddha's original practice.
And they have concrete, pretty ambitious plans for this, right?
Oh yeah, very
Wow.
ambitious. They plan to establish an international practice school right there in Bodh Gaya, India, the very site of the Buddha's enlightenment.
Going right back to the source location.
Exactly. And the school's training will be based on original texts and place a very, very strong emphasis on practice. Practice is paramount.
That's quite a commitment. What's the vision beyond the school itself?
It's a global vision. They mention these long-term plans to send graduates worldwide. Specifically, they talk about targeting sending 50% of their graduates to the U.S. for 100 years.
100 years.
Yes, aiming to significantly influence the direction of American Buddhism. Others would remain in India or return to places like Korea.
A 100-year plan is certainly thinking long-term. How do they see this effort differing from past reforms?
They contrast this effort with past reform movements, particularly in Korean Buddhism, which they feel were ultimately unsuccessful because they modeled themselves on later developments like Mahayana movements or looking towards Maitreya, rather than returning to the initial fundamental standards set by the Buddha himself.
So this new effort is distinct because its reference point is the very earliest practices and teachings.
Exactly. They emphasize that this initiative prioritizes practice as the fundamental core, the engine of reform. They contrast this with some other reform efforts, perhaps like those in Thailand or Sri Lanka, which might focus heavily on scriptures, on textual purity, but perhaps lack this same depth of emphasis on practice as the primary driver.
Got it. The source also briefly mentions concepts like a third eye. What's the take there?
Yes. The speaker views such concepts, which they suggest might be influenced by things like the Upanishads or later Hinduism, as lacking essential meaning in the core Buddhist context as they understand it. They see it as more of an external influence, not central to the path of liberation taught by the Buddha.
Okay, an aside but fits the critical lens. And the workshop transcript ends with a specific dedication.
Yes, it mentions that the practitioners in their school recite a dedication prayer. They direct the merit, the positive energy of their practice towards universal well-being.
What kind of well-being?
It includes aspirations for freedom and happiness, naturally, but also peace, justice, understanding, consideration, tolerance, inclusion, harmony, and togetherness for all beings. It's very encompassing.
That's a very broad and positive set of goals to dedicate your practice to.
It is, and it includes that specific mantra we mentioned earlier, Suri Suri Mahasuri Sutri Svaha,
Which means?
which they link to cleansing. So perhaps symbolizing the cleansing of defilements or obstacles, clearing the path for that universal benefit.
Okay, so we've really taken a deep dive into this transcript, which offers a powerfully critical perspective on Buddhist history, texts, and especially practice. It really challenges some widely held assumptions by urging a return to the fundamentals emphasized by the speaker.
Yeah, we've explored the importance of understanding the historical Buddha's actual context, the call for critical examination of later developments in texts, especially that provocative idea of some later Mahayana texts being more like historical novels than direct history.
That one definitely sticks with you.
It does. And the potential for cultural bias, like Buddhist Orientalism, even in adopting modern practices. And throughout it all, the absolute centrality of practice and self-power for achieving what the Source presents as the core Buddhist goals: freedom and happiness.
It certainly provides a lot to think about. Here's a final thought for you, the listener. If the Buddha's core message, as presented in this source, is truly about achieving happiness and liberation through diligent self-power and practice, well, how might that challenge or change the way you personally view or perhaps engage with Buddhist ideas or practices in your own life?
It's a potent question, isn't it? Sits right at the heart of this critical approach. Maybe this deep dive inspires you to look further into critical Buddhism or the history of the Buddha or the specific practices mentioned, but with this new, maybe more critical perspective in mind.